It wasn't the audible gasp from the crowd of dusty settlers and stoic warriors that marked the moment. It was the sudden dead silence that followed. Every eye was on Nathaniel Shaw, the blacksmith whose hands were as steady as the anvil he worked. He stood before Chief Black Kettle, having been given the rarest of honors, the right to speak for a daughter. Everyone knew who he would choose. It had to be Mourning Dove, a woman whose beauty was a legend whispered from the Black Hills to the Platte River. But Nathaniel's gaze drifted past her, past the perfect face and confident smile, and settled on the woman standing in her sister's shadow. He spoke a name, and in that instant, he didn't just choose a wife. He chose a war. He rejected the jewel of the tribe for the one they called the broken sparrow, the one no strong man wanted. And no one could understand why. The rhythm of Red Creek Bend was the clang of Nathaniel Shaw's hammer. It was a sound of certainty in a land that offered very little of it. The ring of steel on steel was the town's heartbeat, a steady percussion against the whisper of the prairie wind and the distant lowing cattle. Nathaniel's forge was the first thing travelers saw when they approached from the east, and the last thing they smelled a comforting scent of coal smoke and hot iron. Nathaniel himself was much like his work, solid, unassuming, and forged in fire. He was not a tall man, but broad in the shoulder and deep in the chest, with arms corded from a decade of his trade. His face, often smudged with soot, was a quiet landscape of steady blue eyes, a square jaw and a mouth that rarely smiled, but was quick with a nod of respect. He had come west 3 years prior, leaving behind a small grave in Ohio, and a silence in his heart that the endless sky seemed to understand. He spoke little of his past, and the townsfolk, respecting the unspoken code of the frontier, asked even less. He was simply Shaw the blacksmith, a man you could count on to mend a broken axle or shoe a difficult horse. His life was a loop of heat, metal, and solitude. He'd rise before the sun stoked the forge until its heart glowed with a furious orange, and work until the purple twilight bled across the plains. His interactions were transactional. He'd trade repaired tools for flour and salt from Henderson's mercantile, accept a silver dollar for shoeing a rancher's prize stallion, and nod to the passing soldiers from Fort Grant. It was a life of substance, not spectacle. That was why the arrival of Chief Black Kettle's daughters at the trading post always felt like a disruption of the natural order. They came with their father and a few warriors to trade fine hides for sugar coffee and woven blankets, and when they came, the town stopped. More accurately, the town stopped for Mourning Dove. She was aptly named. Her beauty was like the first light of day, stunning and undeniable. She had a face that could make a pious man forget his prayers, with high cheekbones, eyes the color of dark river stones, and a smile that she used with the precision of a master marksman. She moved with a liquid grace, aware of the spell she cast. Men, settlers, trappers, and soldiers alike would find excuses to be at the mercantile when she was there. They'd lean against posts, suddenly fascinated by the price of beans, their gazes covertly tracking her every move. The young warriors of her own tribe were no different, posturing and speaking in louder tones whenever she was near. And then there was Fawn. She was Mourning Dove's shadow, perpetually a step behind her presence, as quiet as a deer in the underbrush. Where Mourning Dove was vibrant, Fawn was muted. She was slighter of build, with the same dark hair as her sister, but it was often tied back simply without the intricate beading Mourning Dove favored. Her face was of a softer, less dramatic composition, but it was her eyes that held a story. They were a lighter shade of brown, flecked with gold, and they missed nothing. While Mourning Dove preened under the town's collective stare, Fawn observed. She watched the way Mrs. Henderson counted her coins, the wear on a horse's shoddy hoof, the nervous twitch in a young soldier's hand. But the world saw only one thing when it looked at Fawn, the slight, dragging limp in her left leg. It was an imperfection, a flaw in the lineage that had produced the perfect mourning dove. It was the reason the whispers in the settlement and the silence in her own camp followed her. The strong warriors of her people wanted a wife who was whole, whose stride was as flawless as her beadwork. Fawn was seen as broken goods. Nathaniel had seen them many times. He was immune to the spell of mourning dove. He had known a woman whose beauty was not a performance, but a quiet warmth, and he had buried her. He had no patience for displays. But Fawn, he noticed her. He saw her not for the limp, but for the stillness she possessed. While her sister soaked in adoration, Fawn would often wander to the edge of the mercantile's porch, her gaze fixed on the far-off horizon, a deep and melancholic patience in her posture. On a blistering afternoon in late August, the heat shimmering off the dusty street, Nathaniel was quenching a newly forged hinge when the chief's party arrived. As usual, the town's rhythm shifted. Bartholomew Thorne, the corpulent owner of the biggest cattle ranch in the territory, swaggered out of the saloon, wiping beer from his mustache, his piggy eyes immediately locking on to mourning dove. Soldiers on leave from Fort Grant suddenly found their strolls taking them past the mercantile. Nathaniel worked on the hiss of hot steel in water, a counterpoint to the town's murmuring. He needed a new sack of coal, however, and finally wiped his hands on an oily rag and headed toward the store. As he approached, he saw Fawn standing alone near the water trough, away from the small crowd her sister had gathered inside. She was watching his draft horse, Behemoth, who was tied to a hitching post. The massive animal, usually cantankerous with strangers, stood perfectly still as she gently stroked his velvety nose, her touch so light he barely seemed to notice it. She murmured something to the horse, a soft, low sound that the wind almost carried away. Nathaniel stopped a dozen feet away unnoticed. He saw what others didn't. He saw the gentle confidence in her hands, the lack of fear in her eyes, as she looked at the 1-ton animal. He saw the way she carried herself with a spine straight and proud, as if to compensate for the leg that betrayed her. Suddenly, Mourning Dove swept out of the mercantile, a bolt of bright blue cloth in her hand. "Sister, father is ready to leave. Stop playing with the workhorse." Her voice was musical, but it held a sharp, dismissive edge. Fawn pulled her hand back from Behemoth, as if burned. She didn't look at her sister, but simply nodded and turned her limp more pronounced as she moved to join her family. As she passed Nathaniel, her gaze met his for a fraction of a second. There was no shyness in her eyes, no shame. There was just a flash of that profound, quiet intelligence, a flicker of acknowledgement before she looked away. In that fleeting moment, Nathaniel Shaw felt the first disturbance in the solitary peace he had so carefully constructed. It wasn't the clang of his hammer that echoed in his ears as he watched her walk away. It was the profound silence he had seen in her eyes. He saw not a broken woman, but a spirit held in reserve, a strength the world was too blind to recognize. And he, a man who judged the quality of steel by its integrity, not its shine, found himself wanting to know more. The choice Nathaniel Shaw was contemplating did not form in a single flash of insight, but rather grew like a crystal, in the dark, slowly facet by facet, shaped by the pressures of the world around him. Red Creek Bend was a town that ran on whispers, and in the days following the sisters' visit, those whispers swirled around the forge like dust devils. In the evenings after the forge had cooled and the scent of coal smoke lingered in the twilight air, Nathaniel would take his meal at the saloon. It wasn't for the company, but for Mrs. Gable's beef stew, a welcome respite from his own cooking. The saloon was the town's sounding board, the place where opinions were forged and reputations hammered into shape. And the prevailing opinion was that Mourning Dove was a prize worth fighting for. I tell you, Thorn, a woman like that on your arm, it would make you a king in this territory. A greasy-haired trapper named Finch declared one night, his voice loud with cheap whiskey. Bartholomew Thorn, holding court at his usual corner table, took a long pull from his tankard. A king needs a queen, not a savage princess, he rumbled, but his eyes held a covetous gleam. Still a man could do worse. She has spirit, and look at her built like a fine thoroughbred. The men around the table grunted in agreement. They spoke of her as if she were a claim to be staked a fine horse to be broken. Their talk was coarse and proprietary, reducing her to a collection of desirable parts. Nathaniel sat at the bar, nursing a lukewarm beer, the conversations washing over him. Then the talk inevitably turned to the other sister. Shame about the other one, Finch said, shaking his head. The gimp, like a prize steer born with a crooked leg, ruins the whole value. They say she's cursed another man, a prospector with wild eyes, chimed in from the bar. One of their young warriors, Stoneheart's brother, died a few winters back, fell from a ledge. They say she was with him, that she carries bad luck. Nathaniel's grip tightened on his mug. He'd heard fragments of this story before. Stoneheart was a formidable warrior, known for his prowess and his pride. He was also the most ardent of Mourning Dove's suitors from her own tribe, his glare a constant warning to any who looked at her too long. The idea that his brother's death was tied to Fawn explained much about the shadow that followed her. It wasn't just the limp, it was the stain of suspicion. It's not bad luck, it's a bad omen, Thorn corrected his voice, carrying an air of authority. Mixing with their kind brings nothing but trouble. Sure, over there he's smart, keeps to himself, tends his fire. A man should stick to his own kind. Thorn shot a look at Nathaniel, a challenging smirk on his fleshy face. Nathaniel met his gaze but said nothing. He had no love for Thorn. The rancher saw the land and its people as resources to be exploited. He saw the Sioux as a temporary inconvenience, a problem that the army would eventually solve. To Thorn, a man's worth was measured in acreage and head of cattle, and Nathaniel's small plot and solitary forge were objects of contempt. The whispers were not confined to the saloon. A few days later, while reshoeing a horse for a cavalry lieutenant from Fort Grant, Nathaniel overheard two soldiers talking. "Did you see the chief's daughters last week?" one asked a young man with a peach fuzz mustache. The pretty one who could miss her, the other replied. "I'd trade a month's pay for one dance with her if they danced." "Not her." The other one. The quiet one with the limp. There's something unsettling about her. The way she watches everything. It's like she's looking right through you. Nathaniel hammered a nail into the hoof with more force than necessary. The horse flinched. He gentled it with a low word and a firm hand, his mind replaying the soldier's words. Unsettling. That's what they saw. Where he had seen quiet intelligence, they saw something strange and unnerving. They were afraid of what they didn't understand. The final piece fell into place during a visit from Stoneheart himself. The warrior didn't come to the forge for work. He came as a statement. He rode his powerful war pony right up to the wide-open doors of the smithy, dismounting with an arrogant grace. He was tall and imposing, his face a mask of chiseled stone, his eyes burning with an intensity that bordered on rage. Two other warriors remained on their horses, behind him. Blacksmith Stoneheart said his voice, a low growl. He did not look at Nathaniel's face, but at his hands, as if assessing a tool. Nathaniel straightened from the anvil, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He merely nodded, waiting. "You make knives," Stoneheart stated, his gaze sweeping over the racks of tools and finished blades on the wall. "I do. I need a new skinning knife, a strong one. The blade must be long and thin. The handle made of dark wood." He described the weapon with a chilling precision. It was clear this was not a simple request for a tool. It was a test, a display of power. "I can make such a knife," Nathaniel said, his tone even. Stoneheart finally looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "Many men come to Red Creek Bend. They look at our women. They look at Mourning Dove." He said her name with a fierce possessiveness. "They think beauty is a prize to be taken by any man with pale skin and a loud voice." "A man's thoughts are his own," Nathaniel replied calmly. "Actions are not Stoneheart," countered, taking a step closer. The smell of leather horse and something wild and dangerous emanated from him. "She is not for you. She is not for any of you. She will be wife to a great warrior. The best." The implication was clear. He was the best. Nathaniel held his gaze, his own blue eyes, as unyielding as the iron he worked. He didn't care for Mourning Dove, but he bristled at the warrior's arrogance, the assumption that he, like all the other white men, was captivated by her. A woman is not a horse to be claimed by the strongest rider. Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but firm. A flicker of surprise, then deeper anger crossed Stoneheart's face. He was not used to being contradicted, especially by a white man who worked with his hands. "You are a blacksmith. You understand metal. You do not understand our ways. Stay with your fire. It is safer for you." With that, he turned on his heel and swung himself onto his pony, his warriors falling in behind him. They galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of menace in the air. Nathaniel stood for a long time in the doorway of his forge, watching the dust settle. The world had told him its opinion. The settlers saw Fawn as broken. The soldiers saw her as unsettling. Her own people, led by men like Stoneheart, saw her as cursed and unlucky. Everyone had defined her by her limp, by a tragedy she was associated with, and by the blinding light of her sister's beauty. No one, it seemed, had ever bothered to simply look at her, to see the person. The whispers on the wind had meant to warn him away, to reinforce the world's harsh judgment. But for Nathaniel Shaw, they did the opposite. They clarified his purpose. He wasn't just intrigued by Fawn anymore. He felt a fierce, protective anger on her behalf. The world had cast her in shadow, and he felt an undeniable urge to see what would happen if someone finally chose to stand in that shadow with her. An opportunity for interaction beyond a fleeting glance came sooner than Nathaniel expected, and it arrived in the form of a crisis. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, its bruised purple clouds swallowing the setting sun, Nathaniel's horse, Behemoth, came up lame. The giant draft animal, his partner in the hard labor of the forge, had a stone deeply wedged in his frog, and in his thrashing to get free, he'd strained his foreleg. By morning, the leg was swollen and hot to the touch. Nathaniel did what he could. He was a blacksmith, not a veterinarian, but he knew horses. He soaked the leg in cold water from the creek and tried to keep the animal calm, but Behemoth was in pain, his usual placid nature replaced by agitated snorting and stamping. The fort's farrier was days away with a patrol, and no one in Red Creek Bend had more knowledge than Nathaniel himself. He remembered the sight of Fawn with the horse, the easy confidence in her touch. The memory filed away, now presented itself as a solution. He knew Chief Black Kettle's camp was a few hours' ride east near the sheltering bluffs of the Powder River. It was a risk. A white man riding into their camp unannounced could be seen as a threat. But the thought of Behemoth suffering was more than he could bear. He saddled his smaller riding mare, filled a canteen, and set out at dawn. The camp was nestled in a cottonwood grove, the smoke from cooking fires rising in thin columns against the vast blue sky. As he approached, a pair of lookouts on ponies intercepted him, their faces hard and questioning. Nathaniel raised an open palm in the universal sign of peace. "I am Nathaniel Shaw, the blacksmith from Red Creek Bend," he said, slowly and clearly. "My workhorse is injured. I have come seeking help. I was told there are those among you skilled in healing animals." He didn't mention Fawn by name. He didn't know if her skills were acknowledged or if his asking for her would cause trouble. The warriors exchanged a look. One of them grunted and motioned for him to follow. He was led not to the chief's lodge, but to a smaller one on the edge of the camp, set slightly apart from the others. An old woman sat outside grinding herbs with a stone pestle. This was Swiftwater, the tribe's healer. The warrior spoke to her, his words short and guttural. The old woman looked at Nathaniel with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of 1,000 seasons. She listened, then nodded and called out a name. Fawn emerged from the lodge. She wore a simple doeskin dress, and her expression was one of mild surprise at seeing him there. She listened as Swiftwater explained the situation, her gaze occasionally flicking to Nathaniel, a silent question in their depths. When the old woman finished, Fawn looked directly at Nathaniel. "Your horse. What is the injury?" Her voice was low and melodic, the first time he had heard her speak more than a single word. A stone in the hoof now removed. But the leg is swollen full of heat. He favors it badly. She considered this for a moment. "I will need to see the animal." There was no question of payment, no hesitation. There was only a quiet statement of fact. Swiftwater gave her a leather pouch, and Fawn moved to her pony, a scruffy-looking animal that seemed to have the same understated resilient quality as its owner. She mounted with an agility that belied her limp, swinging her good leg over before settling into the saddle. The ride back to Red Creek Bend was conducted almost entirely in silence. Nathaniel was not a man for idle chatter, and Fawn, it seemed, was even less so. Yet the silence was not uncomfortable. It was a shared space, filled with the sounds of the prairie, the rustle of the wind through the tall grass, the cry of a hawk circling overhead, the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves. Nathaniel found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him. He noticed the way she sat her horse, her back straight, her focus constantly scanning the landscape. She was a part of it, not just a traveler passing through. When they arrived at the forge, Behemoth was worse, his breathing labored. Fawn slid from her pony and approached the great horse without a hint of fear. She spoke to him in the same soft, murmuring tone Nathaniel had heard at the water trough. Behemoth, who would have kicked any other stranger who came near him in his current state, went still. His ears, which had been pinned back in agitation, flickered and then relaxed. Fawn ran her hands down the swollen leg, her touch both firm and infinitely gentle. Her fingers probed and assessed, reading the horse's injury in a way Nathaniel, with all his strength, could not. She diagnosed it as a deep muscle strain, complicated by a possible infection from the stone's wound. For the next 2 hours she worked. She opened her leather pouch and created a poultice from crushed herbs and dark mud, mixing it with hot water from Nathaniel's kettle. The forge, usually a place of fire and force, became a quiet infirmary. As she applied the warm paste to the horse's leg, she never stopped her low, soothing monologue. It was a language of reassurance, a sound that transcended words. Nathaniel watched, mesmerized. He saw the absolute focus in her face, the deep well of knowledge in her actions. This was not a broken woman. This was a healer, a person of profound skill and empathy. Her limp, her quietness, the rumors, all of it faded away, replaced by the reality of her competence. Just as she was beginning to wrap the leg in clean cloths, a shadow fell across the doorway. Mourning Dove stood there, flanked by Stoneheart. They had evidently followed, or perhaps been sent by the chief to ensure his daughter's safety. "Sister, what are you doing?" Mourning Dove's voice was laced with a familiar, cloying condescension. "You are covered in mud. This is blacksmith's work." Fawn didn't look up. "The horse is in pain. I am helping." Stoneheart stared at Nathaniel, his expression a mixture of contempt and suspicion. He saw this not as an act of healing, but as a transgression. A white man had summoned one of their women to his home, to his place of work. And worse, it was the woman tied to his family's tragedy. "Your work is finished," Fawn Stoneheart said, his voice flat and hard. "We will take you back." Mourning Dove stepped closer, looking at Nathaniel with a dazzling smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My sister has a soft spot for wounded things, blacksmith. You must forgive her. She does not know her place." She then turned her attention to Nathaniel's forge, her gaze sweeping over it with a theatrical curiosity. "You are very strong to work in this heat all day." It was a blatant attempt to capture his attention, to pull the focus back to herself. But Nathaniel's focus was on Fawn, as she carefully tied the last knot on the bandage. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and finally met her sister's gaze. "My place is where I am needed," Fawn said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of solid iron. "The horse will need the poultice changed tomorrow." This last part was directed at Nathaniel. Nathaniel nodded his respect for her, growing with every passing second. "I would be grateful if you would show me how." A silent challenge passed between them, an agreement made in the face of her sister's vanity and the warrior's hostility. Stoneheart's jaw tightened, and Mourning Dove's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She had been dismissed, her beauty rendered irrelevant by a simple act of competence. As Fawn left with her escort, she gave Nathaniel one last look over her shoulder. It was a look of shared understanding. In the silent language of their afternoon, together something profound had been communicated. Nathaniel Shaw now knew with absolute certainty that the whispers of the world were wrong. The world saw a flaw to be pitied. He saw a strength to be admired. The annual fall gathering at Red Creek Bend was the closest thing the disparate collection of souls on that stretch of the frontier had to a festival. It was a time when trappers came down from the mountains with their season's haul, when ranchers brought in their finest cattle to sell, and when Chief Black Kettle's people came for the largest trade of the year. The dusty street was lined with stalls, the saloon did business from sunup to sundown, and a fragile truce, lubricated by commerce and whiskey, settled over the town. This year the air was thick with more than just the scent of roasting meat and wood smoke. It was thick with expectation. Rumors had solidified into belief a significant offer was going to be made for one of the chief's daughters. The consensus was that Bartholomew Thorne, in a bid to consolidate his power and create an alliance of sorts, was going to make a formal offer for Mourning Dove. He had been parading around town for days, boasting of the fine horses and rifles he was prepared to give. Simultaneously, within the Sioux camp, it was understood that Stoneheart would finally make his own formal claim, offering a bride price of such magnitude that it would secure his status and honor. Mourning Dove was in her element. She moved through the crowded settlement like royalty, adorned in a dress of the finest white doeskin, intricately decorated with porcupine quills and beads. She smiled, she laughed, and she allowed the admiring gazes of both white and native men to wash over her. She was the undisputed prize, and this was her coronation. Nathaniel Shaw felt like a man walking toward his own execution. He had spent the past weeks in a state of quiet turmoil. Thorn had returned twice more to tend to Behemoth, whose leg was now nearly healed. Their time together was always the same, conducted in a comfortable silence, punctuated by her soft-spoken instructions and his quiet acknowledgments. He learned how to mix the poultice, how to test the heat in the horse's leg, how to wrap it properly. Through these simple actions, he saw her patience, her intelligence, and the deep abiding kindness that the world refused to see. He had made his decision. He knew it was madness. He knew it would be seen as an insult, a provocation, a fool's errand. But his heart, long dormant, had been rekindled not by a blazing fire, but by a steady, persistent warmth. He had to try. He closed his forge for the day, a rare occurrence. He washed away the grime and soot in a bucket of cold water, scrubbing his hands until they were raw. He put on a clean, homespun shirt, the one he saved for funerals and holidays. Then he walked to the center of town, where Chief Black Kettle was negotiating a trade for winter blankets with Mr. Henderson outside the mercantile. A crowd had already gathered. Thorn was there, flanked by two of his ranch hands, a smug look on his face. Stoneheart stood with his own warriors, his arms crossed his expression, one of pure, unadulterated confidence. Mourning Dove and Fawn stood behind their father. Mourning Dove was radiant, her eyes sparkling with triumph. Fawn was almost invisible beside her, her gaze fixed on a loose thread on her father's sleeve, seemingly oblivious to the drama unfolding. Chief Black Kettle Thorn boomed, stepping forward and interrupting the negotiations. "We have traded goods. Now let us speak of more important matters, of alliances, of families." The chief, a man of immense dignity, turned his weathered face toward the rancher. "Speak then, Bartholomew Thorn." "I wish to take a wife," Thorn declared, his voice full of self-importance. "I wish to offer for your daughter, Mourning Dove. I offer 10 of my finest horses, 20 new rifles from the east, and 100 wool blankets." A collective intake of breath came from the crowd. It was a staggering offer, a fortune on the frontier. It was an offer of power. Mourning Dove's smile widened. This was more than she could have hoped for. Before the chief could respond, Stoneheart stepped forward, his movements like those of a panther. "The daughter of Black Kettle will not be bought with the white man's trinkets," he sneered. "I, Stoneheart, offer 30 horses, 20 of them broken for war. I offer the pelts of 50 beaver. And I offer my loyalty, the loyalty of a warrior who will one day lead his people." The tension was palpable. It was a clash of worlds, of wealth, of pride, all centered on one woman. Chief Black Kettle looked from one man to the other, his face unreadable. He was about to speak when another voice cut through the air, quiet but clear as a bell. Chief Black Kettle. Every head turned. Nathaniel Shaw had stepped out of the crowd. He looked small and plain compared to the swaggering rancher and the imposing warrior. His wealth was in his calloused hands, and the sweat of his brow not in horses or rifles. Thorn snorted in derision. Stoneheart's eyes narrowed to slits of pure hatred. The blacksmith, the chief, said, his tone neutral, though a flicker of surprise showed in his eyes. "You wish to speak?" "I do." Nathaniel said, his heart hammering against his ribs. He walked forward until he stood before the chief, ignoring the hostile stares. He did not look at Mourning Dove, who was watching him with a curious, almost amused expression, as if he were a strange dog that had wandered into the gathering. "I also wish to take a wife." Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "I am not a rich man like Mr. Thorn. I am not a great warrior like Stoneheart. I have no horses or rifles to offer you." A wave of ridicule rippled through the onlookers. Thorn laughed out loud. "Then what are you wasting our time for, Shaw? Go back to your fire." Nathaniel ignored him, his eyes locked on the chief. "What I have is my forge, my strength, my skill. I will forge for your people the finest tools, the strongest knives, the best arrowheads you have ever seen. I will mend what is broken. I will keep your horses shod for 100 winters. I offer my hands, my work, and my life in service to your family. I offer my sworn loyalty and my protection. This is my bride price." The chief was silent, his gaze intense. This was an unusual offer, one of honor and skill, rather than material wealth. It held a different kind of value. "And for which daughter do you make this offer?" Black Kettle asked, his voice low. This was the moment, the pivot upon which everything would turn. Nathaniel felt the weight of every eye in the settlement upon him. He took a deep breath. He turned his head slightly, his gaze deliberately passing over the beautiful, expectant face of Mourning Dove. He looked past her, past the shock that was beginning to dawn in her eyes, and met the wide, startled gaze of the woman standing in her shadow. "I offer this for your daughter, Nathaniel," said his voice, ringing with a conviction that silenced the entire street. "Fawn." For a full 10 seconds there was no sound but the whisper of the wind. The silence was more profound, more shocking than any shout. Thorn's jaw hung open. Mourning Dove's face a moment before, so radiant, collapsed into a mask of disbelief, then fury, then utter humiliation. It was a public, brutal rejection of everything she was. But it was Fawn's reaction that Nathaniel would remember for the rest of his life. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, with a shock so pure it was almost painful to see. She stared at him as if he were a ghost, as if he had spoken a language no one else could understand. For the first time, someone had not only looked past her limp, but had looked past her beautiful sister, and had chosen her. Then the silence broke. Stoneheart let out a roar of pure, guttural rage. It was not the rage of a spurned suitor for Mourning Dove. It was the rage of a man whose deepest prejudice had been defied. The blacksmith had not only insulted the prize of the tribe he had chosen, the cursed one, the tainted one. He had chosen the woman associated with his brother's death. It was an incomprehensible insult. "You," Stoneheart bellowed, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "You would dishonor the chief's house. You would choose the broken sparrow over the eagle." Chief Black Kettle raised a hand, and the authority in that simple gesture stopped Stoneheart in his tracks. The chief's ancient eyes bored into Nathaniel, searching, questioning. He saw no mockery there, no trickery. He saw only a quiet, resolute sincerity. He looked at his younger daughter, who was still frozen, her hand half raised to her chest, as if to keep her heart from beating out of it. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope he hadn't seen since she was a small child before the fall that had marked her, before the whispers had started. "The blacksmith's offer is one of honor," the chief announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "It is a strong offer. I will consider it." He then looked at Thorn and Stoneheart. "I will consider all offers. I will give my answer at sundown tomorrow." He turned, and with a motion to his daughters began to walk back toward his camp. Mourning Dove, her face, a thunderous mask of shame, followed stiffly. Fawn hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting Nathaniel's one last time. In their depths he saw not just shock, but a terrifying, fragile question. Why Nathaniel Shaw stood alone in the middle of the street, the crowd parting around him as if he carried a plague. He had forged many things from fire. He had just forged a war. The day following Nathaniel's declaration was the longest of his life. The sun seemed to crawl across the sky each hour, stretching into an eternity. Red Creek Bend, which had been boisterous with the gathering, became a town of furtive glances and hushed conversations. Nathaniel was no longer just the town blacksmith. He was a pariah, a madman who had publicly snubbed beauty and common sense. He retreated to his forge but found no solace in his work. The fire felt cold, the hammer heavy and clumsy in his hands. Every shadow that flickered at the edge of his vision made him jump. He was a man adrift, having cast off from the safe shore of anonymity into a sea of hostility. Bartholomew Thorne was the first to make his displeasure known. The rancher, his ego wounded, as much as his ambitions, saw Nathaniel's choice as a personal affront and a betrayal of his race. He strode into the forge late in the morning, his face flushed with anger. "Sure you've lost your mind," Thorne spat, kicking a pile of scrap iron. "You had the whole town laughing at me, at us choosing that broken thing over a prize like mourning dove. You're making all of us look like fools. My choice is my own," Thorne Nathaniel said, not looking up from the horseshoe he was pretending to shape. "It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me," Thorne roared. "It has to do with order, with knowing what's valuable and what's trash. You've insulted the chief. You've made an enemy of Stoneheart. And for what, a crippled squaw, who probably has more bad luck than a three-legged coyote." Nathaniel placed the horseshoe back into the coals and turned to face the rancher, his blue eyes glinting with a cold fire. "You will not speak of her that way." Or what Thorne sneered, taking a step back. "He was a bully, not a fighter. You'll hit me with your hammer. You're finished in this town, sure. I'll see to it that no one from my ranch or any other decent outfit brings you so much as a single bent nail. We'll see how long your forge stays hot when your customers disappear." He stormed out, leaving the threat hanging in the air like foul smoke. The threat was not an idle one. By noon, 2 different homesteaders who had jobs pending with Nathaniel came by, shuffling their feet and making excuses, and took their business elsewhere. The isolation was beginning. The more immediate threat, however, came from Stoneheart. The warrior did not confront Nathaniel directly. His methods were more insidious. In the afternoon, Nathaniel discovered the leather strap on his bellows had been sliced clean through rendering it useless. It was a subtle act of sabotage, one that crippled his ability to work. He spent hours painstakingly repairing it, his anger a slow burn. Later, as he went to the creek for water, one of Stoneheart's warriors rode by at a full gallop, accidentally spooking his riding mare, who broke her tether and bolted for the hills. It took him until dusk to track her down. These were warnings, small tests of his resolve. Stoneheart was showing him that his life could be made difficult, even impossible. The message was clear: rescind your offer. You do not belong here. But the heaviest consequence was the one he couldn't see. It was the turmoil he had unleashed in Fawn's life. He worried endlessly about her. Had he made things worse for her? Had his public declaration simply put a larger target on her back? Her sister's scorn, the tribe's derision, her father's difficult position, he had thrown all of it into chaos. As sundown approached, Nathaniel felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He didn't expect the chief to choose him. His offer was honorable but intangible. Thorne's offer was wealth, and Stoneheart's was power and tradition. He was an outsider, a nobody. He saw the rider approaching from the east and his heart sank. It was one of the chief's warriors, but not Stoneheart. The man rode directly to the forge and dismounted. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that was the antithesis of Stoneheart's arrogance. The blacksmith the warrior asked, "I am. Chief Black Kettle has made his decision. He accepts your offer." The word seemed to hang in the air, unreal. Nathaniel could only stare. He accepts." The warrior nodded. "The chief says that wealth can be stolen and horses can die." but skill and honor are woven into a man's spirit. He says you saw with your heart, not just your eyes. He believes such a man will be a strong protector for his daughter. A wave of relief so profound it made him weak washed over Nathaniel. But it was followed by a chilling realization. The chief's decision had not averted a war, it had formally declared it. "There is more," the warrior said, his face grim. Stoneheart does not accept the chief's decision. He has invoked the old custom, the challenge of worth. He says you have no right to fawn, that you are a white man who has not proven his strength. He challenges you. To a fight, Nathaniel asked, his hand instinctively clenching. No, not a fight to the death. That is forbidden by the chief. It is a trial of survival. At the first snow, you and Stoneheart will be taken to the ghost canyons. You will be left with only a knife, a water skin, and the clothes you wear. The first man to return to the camp with the feather of a golden eagle is the winner. He is deemed the stronger man, the one more worthy in the eyes of the spirits. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. The ghost canyons were a treacherous maze of rock and shadow, a place where men got lost and were never seen again. It was a place where winter came early and without mercy, and the golden eagles nested on the highest, most inaccessible cliffs. Stoneheart had grown up in this land. He knew its secrets, its dangers, its hiding places. Nathaniel was a blacksmith. He knew fire and metal, not how to hunt and track in a frozen wilderness. It was a death sentence disguised as a trial. If I refuse, Nathaniel asked, though he already knew the answer. To refuse is to admit you are a coward, that your offer was empty. You will be banished from these lands. And Fawn, her shame will be greater than it ever was before. She will be the woman chosen by a coward. There was no choice. To back down now would be to destroy the very woman he sought to honor. He would be proving her detractors right, that she was only worthy of a man of no substance. "Tell the chief," Nathaniel said, his voice hoarse, "and tell Stoneheart. I accept the challenge." The warrior nodded, once a flicker of respect in his eyes. He mounted his pony and rode away, leaving Nathaniel alone with the immense, terrifying weight of his consequences. He had won Fawn's hand, only to have to wager his life to keep it. As the last light of day faded, he looked towards the distant, darkening mountains. Winter was coming. The trial began with the first snow, a furious blizzard that descended without warning. Nathaniel and Stoneheart were taken to the treacherous ghost canyons, each given a knife and a robe, and tasked with returning with a golden eagle feather. As the storm raged for 2 days, Nathaniel focused only on survival, knowing the warrior was likely thriving in the harsh conditions. When the blizzard broke, Nathaniel followed the faint cry of a man in distress, discovering Stoneheart at the bottom of a ravine. The warrior had fallen, his leg crushed and pinned between 2 massive boulders. Victory was within Nathaniel's grasp. He could simply walk away and leave his rival to the elements. Instead, remembering Fawn's compassion, he chose to help. He spent hours trying to free Stoneheart, giving the injured man his own water and robe. As night fell, a figure appeared on the slope above them. It was Fawn. She had followed, fearing the trial was a death sentence in disguise. Seeing they could not move the rock, she devised a desperate plan. She directed Nathaniel to trigger a small avalanche from the ledge above, and the resulting cascade of snow and ice shifted the boulder just enough to free Stoneheart. As Fawn expertly splinted the warrior's leg, the truth buried for years finally came to light. "You call me cursed," she said, her voice unwavering, "but your brother died because you goaded him into a foolish climb to impress my sister. I tried to save him. The fall that killed him is the same one that shattered my leg." Stoneheart stared at her, the hatred in his eyes replaced by dawning horror and shame. His long-held lie, a shield for his own guilt, was exposed. In that moment of raw truth, a single golden eagle feather spiraled down from the sky, landing softly on the snow between them. The trial was over, but its intended meaning had been completely transformed. The journey back was a slow, arduous procession. They returned not as victor and vanquished, but as three survivors bound by their ordeal. When the tribe saw Stoneheart, their fiercest warrior, being dragged on a travois by the woman he had vilified, and the man he had sworn to destroy, years of hardened beliefs began to unravel. Before the gathered tribe, Fawn told the story, her voice clear and steady. She spoke not only of the canyon, but of the truth behind the death of Stoneheart's brother. Her words were followed by Stoneheart's own raw confession, admitting his pride had caused his brother's death, and his guilt had poisoned his spirit against Fawn. The lie that had defined her life was finally broken. Chief Black Kettle took the eagle feather. He did not give it to Nathaniel, but placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did not win the warrior's trial," he announced for all to hear. "You won the one the spirits intended. You showed mercy is stronger than vengeance. You have proven your worth. My daughter is yours." He then turned to Fawn, his eyes filled with a pride she had never seen. "You have the strength of the mountain. You are a healer of bodies and spirits." Nathaniel and Fawn were married as the snows melted. They built a life on a small plot of land between their two worlds, a place of quiet working partnership. One evening, she finally asked him why he had chosen her. "When other men looked at your sister," he said, taking her hand, "they saw a beautiful flower to be plucked. When I looked at you, I saw the deep roots, the part that holds on in the storm, that survives the winter. The world is full of flowers, Fawn. They bloom and they fade, but the roots endure. I didn't choose what was beautiful. I chose what was real." The frontier was a place that judged people harshly, often by the most superficial standards, the shine of a rifle, the speed of a horse, or the flawlessness of a face. But the story of Nathaniel and Fawn reminds us that true worth, real strength, isn't found in the polish and the gleam. It's found in the substance beneath. It's the quiet courage to defy expectation, the compassion to heal an enemy, and the wisdom to see the enduring strength in what the rest of the world has dismissed as broken. Their love story wasn't about a man rescuing a woman. It was about two strong souls recognizing the resilience in each other and building a life that was truer than any legend. If this story of unlikely love and hidden strength moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale where character, not charisma, wins the day. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more true-life dramas from the heart of the Wild West. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.